My name is Rachel Burns, and I want to tell you about the best day of my professional life, which also happened to be the day I walked out of a glass-walled conference room on the 38th floor of a skyscraper in downtown Atlanta with a signed contract worth $4.2 million and the quiet, electric satisfaction of having just watched a man who thought he had destroyed my career realize that he had actually handed me everything I needed to finish the job without him. But I am getting ahead of myself. Good stories deserve proper beginnings, and this one starts 7 years before that conference room, in a cramped open-plan office in Midtown Atlanta where I was 24 years old, fresh out of Georgia State's business school, and absolutely certain that I was going to set the commercial real estate world on fire. The company was called Meridian Property Group. They were a mid-sized commercial real estate firm that specialized in corporate lease negotiations, property acquisitions, and development consulting for large business clients across the Southeast. It was not the biggest firm in Atlanta, but it had a strong reputation, a solid client roster, and what I believed at the time was a genuine culture of merit. You worked hard, you produced results, you moved up. That was the story they told in the interview, and I believed it completely because I was 24 and I had not yet learned that the story a company tells in an interview and the story that actually plays out inside its walls are frequently very different narratives. I was hired as a junior acquisitions associate. My starting salary was modest, my desk was by the supply closet, and my first assignment was to compile comparative market analyses for a senior broker named Tom Garrett, who was too busy to do his own research and not quite busy enough to say thank you when I did it for him. I did it anyway, and I did it well because that is who I am. I have always been the kind of woman who does the work in front of her with everything she has, even when the work is not glamorous and even when no one is watching. Someone was watching, as it turned out. Her name was Sandra Okafor, and she was the head of Meridian's corporate accounts division, a tall, direct woman in her early 50s who had a reputation for being exacting and fair in equal measure. Sandra had noticed the quality of the market analyses I was producing for Tom, and about 8 months into my time at Meridian, she pulled me aside and asked if I had ever thought about moving into direct client work. I told her I had thought about very little else. She laughed and said she could tell, and 2 weeks later, I was transferred into her division as a corporate accounts associate. Those next 4 years under Sandra were the foundation of everything I know about this business. She taught me how to read a client, how to understand what they said they wanted versus what they actually needed, how to structure a deal so that both sides felt like they had won, and how to hold a room when the room did not want to be held. I was good at the technical side already. Sandra made me dangerous. By the time I was 29, I was leading my own client negotiations, and by 30, I had closed 3 of the top 5 revenue-generating deals in the corporate accounts division for that fiscal year. That was also the year that Meridian brought in Derek Cole. Derek Cole was hired as Executive Vice President of Business Development, which was a newly created title that essentially meant he was being positioned to eventually take over from the retiring partner who oversaw both Sandra's division and the acquisition side. He was 41. He had spent the previous decade at a larger firm in Dallas, and he arrived in Atlanta with the particular confidence of a man who has been told he is exceptional so many times that he has stopped questioning it. He was charming in that surface-level way that reads as warmth until you spend enough time around it to realize there is nothing underneath. He had excellent hair. He wore very good suits. He shook hands like he was conferring an honor. From the moment Derek Cole arrived at Meridian, I was on his radar in a way that I recognized and did not like. Not in a personal sense. In a professional sense that was somehow more insidious. Derek had done his homework before he started. He knew who the top performers were in each division, and he knew that I was one of them, and I could see in the way he looked at me during that first all-hands meeting that he had already made some kind of internal calculation. I was an asset he wanted to control, or a threat he wanted to neutralize. He had not decided which yet. It did not take him long to decide. For the first several months Derek was at Meridian, things between us were professionally cordial. He sat in on a few of my client meetings, which I was told was part of his orientation process. He asked good questions and I answered them. He was smart, I will give him that. He absorbed information quickly, and he had strong instincts for deal structure. But I started to notice things. Small things at first. A client relationship I had been cultivating for 8 months suddenly had Derek's name in the correspondence chain without any explanation. A presentation I had built for a major pitch was reformatted and rebranded with Derek listed as lead strategist. When I raised it with Sandra, she told me privately that Derek had gone directly to the managing partner and represented the pitch as something he had developed collaboratively with the team, which was a very generous interpretation of a document I had written almost entirely alone. Sandra was furious on my behalf. But Derek had the managing partner's ear in a way that Sandra did not, and the managing partner was the kind of man who valued a confident male voice in an expensive suit over documented evidence, which is a story as old as offices themselves. Things escalated the following year. Derek was given formal oversight of the corporate accounts division, which meant he was now Sandra's direct superior, which meant he was now 2 levels above me. Sandra left Meridian 6 months after that. She pulled me aside before her last day and told me to document everything, to keep copies of my work product in a personal drive, and to trust my instincts. She hugged me and said she was sorry she was leaving me there, and I told her not to be because I was going to be fine. I intended to be fine. I was working on a deal that I believed was going to be the biggest of my career, and I was not about to let Derek Cole's maneuvering derail it. The deal was with a company called Vantage Consolidated, a logistics and distribution firm based in Charlotte that was looking to establish a major Southeast regional headquarters. They needed somewhere between 40 and 60,000 square feet of classic commercial space in the Atlanta metro area. They had a significant build-out budget, and they had a timeline that was aggressive but workable. The total deal value, including the lease structure, tenant improvement allowances, and the consulting fees Meridian would earn on the transaction, was projected at somewhere between $3 and $5 million depending on how the final terms landed. It was the kind of deal that defined careers. I had been working on it for 5 months. I had cultivated the relationship with Vantage's VP of Operations, a measured, detail-oriented man named Craig Simmons, from the very beginning. Craig trusted me. He had told me directly that the reason Vantage had stayed with Meridian through the evaluation process was because of the quality of my work and his confidence in my ability to see the transaction through. Derek Cole knew all of this. He had been in enough of my status updates to know exactly where the deal stood and exactly how central I was to it, which is why what he did next was so calculated. It was a Thursday afternoon in March. I was preparing for a major site tour with Craig Simmons and 2 other Vantage executives scheduled for the following week, the kind of visit where you take the client through the finalists on your shortlist and let the spaces do their work. I was at my desk reviewing floor plans when Derek's assistant came by and told me Derek wanted to see me in his office. I went. I sat across from Derek in his corner office with the Atlanta skyline behind him, and I listened while he told me, in a voice that was carefully calibrated to sound regretful, that the firm had made a decision to restructure the corporate accounts division and that my position was being eliminated. He told me my last day would be the following Friday. He told me there was a severance package prepared and that HR would walk me through the details. He handed me a folder. He said he hoped I understood this was a business decision and not a reflection of my contributions. He said it so smoothly. It had clearly been rehearsed. And underneath the smoothness, I could see something else, the faintest trace of satisfaction in the set of his jaw, the way his eyes did not quite meet mine when he said the word contributions.
This was not a restructuring.
There had been no restructuring announced. I was the only person in the division being let go. This was Derek Cole removing a threat before the biggest deal of my tenure crossed the finish line, so that he could take credit for closing it himself. I sat in that chair, and I kept my face completely still. I told him I understood. I thanked him for letting me know. I took the folder. I stood up, shook his hand, and walked out of his office. Then I went to the bathroom, locked the stall door, and stood very quietly for about 90 seconds while I processed what had just happened and what I was going to do about it. Here is the thing about being the kind of woman who documents everything. And here is the thing about having spent 5 months building a deal from the ground up. And here's the thing about Craig Simmons, the VP of Operations at Vantage Consolidated, who had my personal cell phone number because I had given it to him 8 weeks earlier when I told him that I was the kind of broker who was reachable whenever he needed me. I had options. I spent that evening at my kitchen table going through everything. My personal drive had every document, every analysis, every draft proposal, every email chain summary, every site evaluation I had produced for the Vantage deal. I had a detailed record of every substantive conversation I had held with Craig Simmons. I had the relationship. And I had something else, something Derek Cole had apparently not considered when he decided to fire me a week before a site tour. I had a non-solicitation agreement with Meridian, yes. But I was a licensed commercial real estate broker independently of Meridian Property Group. And the non-solicitation had a clause, standard in the industry but often overlooked, that did not apply to transactions where the client relationship had been initiated and primarily maintained by the departing broker if the client independently chose to continue working with that broker outside the firm. I had a real estate attorney friend named Gwen Morris who I had gone to school with, and I called her that night. We talked for 2 hours. By the end of the call, I had a clear picture of exactly where I stood legally, and the picture was considerably better than Derek Cole likely assumed. The next morning, I called Craig Simmons. I was professional. I was honest. I told him that I was leaving Meridian at the end of the following week, and that I wanted him to know directly rather than finding out through a form email from the firm. I told him it had been a genuine pleasure working with him and with the Vantage team, and that I had every confidence the deal would be in good hands. I did not make any ask. I did not pitch anything. I simply made the call that any decent professional would make, which was to tell my client directly. Craig Simmons was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me where I was going. I told him the truth. I told him I was not sure yet, that I was exploring options, and that I expected to land somewhere strong fairly quickly given my track record. He said he appreciated me calling. He said he would be in touch. I hung up and I went to work on everything else I needed to do, because I had 6 days left at Meridian and I intended to spend them professionally and strategically. I wrapped up my documentation. I completed every outstanding task I could complete. I said genuine goodbyes to the colleagues I respected. I did not say anything negative about Derek to anyone inside the building. I was a professional until the last possible moment, not because I felt warmly toward the company anymore, but because I knew that how you leave a place follows you, and I intended to leave cleanly. On my second to last day, Craig Simmons called me back. He told me that the Vantage team had discussed the situation and that they had a strong preference for continuity in their broker relationship given how far along the process was. He said they had done some research and understood there was a pathway for them to continue working with me directly if I was operating independently. He asked if that was something I was open to exploring. I told him I would have my attorneys send over a preliminary engagement structure by end of week. I also spent that week making 3 other phone calls. There was a boutique commercial real estate firm in Atlanta called Century Group that I had been aware of for years, run by a woman named Patricia Huang who had a reputation for building a lean, high-performing team and taking on serious deals. I had met Patricia once at an industry event, and she had given me her card and told me to call if I was ever looking for a change. I had kept the card. I called her on Wednesday. We had coffee on Thursday morning. She offered me a senior broker position with a compensation structure that made my Meridian salary look like a starting point. I told her I had an active deal in progress that I would be bringing with me. She looked at me over her coffee cup with an expression that I can only describe as delighted, and she said that she had a feeling about me from the first time we met and that her feelings were rarely wrong. I signed with Century Group on Friday, my last day at Meridian.
Now,
here is where the story gets to the part you have been waiting for. The site tour with Vantage Consolidated was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Derek Cole did not know that I was no longer the broker on the deal from Meridian's side, because as far as Meridian knew, the Vantage deal was still theirs. What Derek also did not know, because Craig Simmons had handled the transition communication quietly and professionally, was that Vantage had formally notified Meridian by letter on Monday afternoon that they were exercising their right to transfer their broker engagement to me personally, citing the established relationship and continuity of representation. That letter had been prepared by Gwen Morris and sent through proper channels, and it was sitting in Meridian's legal department inbox, while Derek Cole was presumably at his desk preparing for a site tour that was no longer his. I know the exact moment he found out, because his assistant called my cell phone at 8:47 Tuesday morning, 45 minutes before the site tour was scheduled to begin. I did not answer. I was already in the lobby of the first property on the tour itinerary, standing with Craig Simmons and the 2 Vantage executives, going over the morning schedule. The site tour went beautifully. The first property was strong, but not quite right. The second had the square footage, but the parking structure was a problem Craig had flagged early on. The third property, a newly developed building in Buckhead that I had identified 4 months ago and quietly kept in reserve for exactly this moment in the process, was the one. I watched Craig Simmons walk through the main floor space, and I watched his body language change, the slight relaxation of his shoulders, the way he stopped taking notes and just looked. That is the moment you live for in this business. When the space does the talking and your job becomes simply to stand nearby and not say anything unnecessary. We were back at the Sentry Group offices by early afternoon. Craig had a 2-hour call with his executive team in Charlotte. At 4:30, he called me and told me they wanted to move forward. He asked how quickly I could have a letter of intent prepared. I told him I could have it to him by 9 the next morning. The final deal closed 6 weeks later. $4.2 million in total transaction value. It was the largest single deal in Sentry Group's history to that point, and Patricia Huang took me to dinner at a restaurant in Buckhead where the food was extraordinary and the champagne was better, and she told me over dessert that I had just made both of our careers considerably more interesting. Now, I promised you a conference room on the 38th floor, and here is where that comes in. About 3 weeks after the Vantage deal closed, I received an invitation through industry channels to speak on a panel at the Southeast Commercial Real Estate Summit, a large annual conference held at a hotel in downtown Atlanta. The panel was on emerging trends in corporate lease negotiations, which was very much my wheelhouse, and I accepted. When I arrived at the conference and checked the panel roster, I discovered that another panelist had been added after the initial lineup was announced. His name was Derek Cole, listed as Executive Vice President of Business Development at Meridian Property Group. I want to be clear that I did not engineer this. I did not arrange for Derek to be on that panel. The real estate industry in Atlanta is a community, and sometimes the community puts people in the same room. The panel was held in a large conference room on the 38th floor of the hotel's tower wing. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a long table, microphones, about 200 people in the audience. Derek was already seated when I came in, and the moment he saw me, I watched his expression do something very quick and complicated. He had not known I would be there. He composed himself immediately because he was good at that, and he smiled and nodded across the table and said my name like we were old colleagues. I smiled back. I sat down. I arranged my notes. The panel was moderated by a woman named Diane Torres from the Georgia Commercial Real Estate Association, and she was sharp and thorough and asked excellent questions. Derek answered several early questions with the polished fluency of someone who had done a lot of panels, and I let him have the floor. I answered my questions carefully and specifically, drawing on real-deal examples without naming clients. The audience was engaged. Things were professional. Then Diane asked the panel about recent standout transactions in the Atlanta market and what they illustrated about current corporate tenant priorities. It was an open question. She invited anyone to lead. Derek went first. He spoke about the corporate accounts pipeline at Meridian, mentioned a few deals in general terms, and then said, with the particular casualness of a man who does not realize he is standing on the edge of something, that Meridian had recently been involved in a significant Buckhead transaction with a major Southeast logistics firm that demonstrated exactly the kind of value a full-service firm could deliver. He was talking about the Vantage deal. My deal. The deal he had fired me to take. Diane turned to me. She asked if I had any recent examples to share. I looked out at the audience for just a moment. Then I looked at Diane, and I said yes, actually, I did. I told the room that I had recently had the privilege of closing a $4.2 million corporate headquarters deal for a major logistics firm relocating to the Atlanta metro area, a transaction I had initiated and led from the earliest stages of client engagement through final execution, that it was the largest deal in my new firm's history, and that it had been completed under my own name as lead broker at Sentry Group, where I had joined following a departure from my previous firm. I did not look at Derek while I said any of this. I did not need to. But when I finished, I did glance across the table. Just briefly. Just enough to see the expression on his face, which was the expression of a man doing rapid, unhappy arithmetic and arriving at a sum he did not enjoy. Diane moved on to the next question. The panel continued. It was all very professional. Afterward, in the networking portion of the evening, Derek found me near the windows at the edge of the room. He was holding a glass of wine, he was not drinking, and wearing a smile that did not reach anywhere near his eyes. He said congratulations on the sentry move. He said it sounded like things were going well. He said the bandage situation had been unfortunate, and that he hoped there were no hard feelings. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about everything he had done. I thought about Sandra leaving. I thought about standing in that bathroom stall, absolutely still, deciding what kind of woman I was going to be about this. I thought about Craig Simmons' shoulders relaxing in that Buckhead building. I thought about Patricia Huang and the champagne and $4.2 million with my name on it. I told Derek that I had no hard feelings at all. I told him that everything had worked out exactly as it should. I told him it was lovely to see him, and I hoped his evening was wonderful. Then I turned and walked toward a group of people across the room who actually wanted to talk to me, and I did not look back. Here is what I know now that I want you to take with you. The Derek Coles of the world are counting on you to be too shocked, too hurt, or too scared to act. They move when they think you are vulnerable, and they assume that vulnerability means helplessness. What they never account for is the woman who has been documenting everything since day one. The woman who maintained her own relationships instead of letting the firm own them. The woman who built something that could not be taken away because it lived in her head and her track record and the trust that real clients placed in her specifically. Derek Cole fired me to take my deal. What he actually did was cut me loose at the exact moment I had everything I needed to close in myself, hand me the freedom to go somewhere better, and give me a story I will be telling for the rest of my career. My name is Rachel Burns. I am a senior broker at Century Group in Atlanta, Georgia. I closed $4.2 million 6 weeks after I was fired, and I did it without raising my voice, without burning a single bridge I wanted to keep, and without giving Derek Cole the satisfaction of seeing me rattled for longer than 90 seconds in a bathroom stall. Some people call that luck. I call it preparation, meeting the moment someone else made the mistake of underestimating me. And I have been keeping records ever since.